Welcome to the TBC podcast, where we discuss curious, thought-provoking, and sometimes controversial ideas through the lens of biblical wisdom. I'm your host, Keith Wood. My guest today is Jordan Karausky, and Jordan is a philosophy student with I think, a very interesting story. Jordan, I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought I could maybe start by giving our listeners a little bit of your background, because I think it's really interesting. So you're prior enlisted in the Army, right? So you served in the Army, did a tour over in Iraq.
That's right.
And then after that, you started a philosophical journey, right? So you did your undergraduate at Rutgers, did a dual major, American history and philosophy, and then you went to Biola University, did an MA in philosophy. That's where I met you, because we did the same program there. And you're currently working at the University of Edinburgh.
That's right.
In Scotland, and you're a candidate for a PhD in philosophy. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. So I think that's a pretty interesting way to get a start in philosophy. And as I've gotten to know you and spent some time talking to you, one of the things that has come up over and over again in our conversations is that you think philosophy is important because it's getting at truth.
Yes.
And you have a deep concern with truth and with accuracy as you're doing philosophy, both as you're working through philosophy and kind of the goal of your philosophy. Truth seems to be presenting itself as an important feature all through that process.
It certainly seems to.
So I thought we could have a conversation today on what is truth. But before we even get to the breaking that concept down and thinking about it, I thought maybe you could say a word about why it is that you seem to be so deeply concerned with truth. Why is it so important to you?
It's a good question. Thanks, Keith. Thanks for the good introduction. I feel introduced. Why is truth important? I think if you think of truth as correspondence with reality, and you think of the mind being calibrated appropriately to the environment or the world around you, you want that to be the case. You want to be appropriately calibrated. And if truth means that I'm like hooked up to the world the right way, then yeah, that's what I want. I want to make sure that when I'm being asked questions, I'm not misleading. When I navigate the world, I'm doing it, I don't know, without bumping into the world. I think Dallas Willard said that truth is or reality is what you bump into when you're wrong, or truth is what you bump into when you're wrong. But reality is what you butt up against. And if you go in correspondence with reality as you navigate the world, then you're going to bump into it a lot less. So you get fewer bumps and bruises as you go. But it's really important to be accurate, I think, for Christians, because we're told where Jesus tells us that He is the truth. And so if we're really I suppose it's like theologically, I think it's important to be appropriately calibrated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'd like to talk more about that. So on one hand, it sounds like you're saying truth has very pragmatic, like survival value.
Yeah.
But then it sounds like you're saying it's also important for maybe they would still be pragmatic, but pragmatic as it relates to your walk with God, your spiritual well-being, not just your physical well-being.
Right.
Is that kind of a fair way to?
Yeah, I suppose. It's like I think that Christians are supposed to be as wise as we can, and if learning is what that takes, if we're constantly having to pursue something like truth, and not everybody gets to be an academic, but if you are capable of pursuing the truth in academia, you're able to come away with tools that you can learn in university and things like that, then yeah, I think we're supposed to do that as Christians. We're supposed to be pursuing truth. And I think I get to do that in a very unique way as an academic. But starting out in the Army and sort of going through that first, I'm not a lifelong academic, so I feel like it was, when I was in the military, I felt like I want to be pursuing these tools to truth and like trying to find a way to correspond appropriately with the world I live in. And now that I get to do that, more systematically and in university, I'm really happy that I get to be in that space. Mm-hmm. But I think Christians are supposed to. I think we're supposed to pursue wisdom. I think we're supposed to pursue truth. And yeah, it seems like it's commanded a lot of times in the New Testament that we're supposed to be wise. Jesus says to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves, because we're sent out as sheep among wolves. Like we're in that position. So it does seem like it's really important to do that theologically, but it also has a lot of survival value. It does seem like things that are deeply theoretical are practical in some way. A lot of times, people usually juxtapose it to like, oh, it's theoretical or it's practical. It's like down to earth, and something that we have to do in our routine and daily lives. It's like, that has nothing to do with this sort of abstract mental life. But the things you believe really underpin the way you act and respond to the world. And if you can manage your beliefs appropriately, if you can really get a lot of wisdom in that area practically or theoretically, you end up coming away with a lot of practical heuristics, you might say, like practical, just practical heuristics, things that you can do on a daily basis. You come away with that sort of thing. Like wisdom is practical. So I think that the two overlap quite a lot, and I get to do that in a unique way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. That's great. I'd like to dig in, if you're willing to share. I'd like to know, were there things that happened in your life that, maybe I could ask it this way, have you always been so interested in pursuing truth at this level, or did you have something of a paradigm shift where you said, you know what, truth is really important and I haven't been following it and now I need to?
Yes. So yeah, when I was younger, I was very concerned with authenticity. I wanted to be authentic. I wanted to be real. I wanted to be, somebody that was trustworthy and dependable. And I felt consistently that I was doubling back on that and being, I don't know, flaky, wishy-washy, not that, I wasn't living authentically. And I had this really deep conviction that you have to be like true to yourself, integrity, something like that. I don't know if I would have phrased it like that when I was younger, but that's how I felt. And as I was growing and being around a lot of the wrong crowd, quite a lot, I was learning that it's like the only way to really live with any integrity is to, say what you mean what you say, and really be committed to like one thing over another. A lot of times I was like, I wanted to be with my secular friends, or I wanted to be in my church. I wanted to be like a Christian, in some way. And I was living this sort of double life for quite a while. And I learned that like you can kind of get a good answer to any question you asked, or a yes answer or a no answer to any question you asked, depending on who you ask. So if you ask your pastor for certain advice, they'll tell you one thing. And then, you ask your parents who are deeply committed to Christianity, they'll tell you something else. And it seems like I would get these wishy-washy answers, and I sort of thought, well, there's no good advice out there. I can kind of just do whatever I want and then apologize later to God if I need to. And that's not integrity. So those things were intention. And what I learned was, over time, I need to sort of make a choice, but the choices all seemed arbitrary. And then I came across a book by C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis gave extremely razor sharp advice by my lights. And that really helped me decide that it was like, well, in order to have integrity, I need to follow the truth. And in order to follow the truth, I need to know what it is. And so I need to get good advice from people who are not going to pull punches and not give me mushy, wishy-washy answers. In order to have that authenticity, I need to be pursuing truth. And so that it's kind of a long roundabout answer, but ultimately what happened was I realized that it's like, well, I need to be following the truth as far as I can see it. And what I learned was that Jesus is the way to go. I need to be pursuing his mission, his life. And that was the way that I ended up. I really just started saying to myself, like, despite all my urges and convictions and everything like that I wanted, and different ways I wanted to manage my life, I need to follow Christ. And in doing that, I learned that it's like there's good reasons to do things. And the truth became a motivator for me, but I was aligned with it in a specific way when I really gave my life over to him. So in any case, but that led me down the path of like, well, how do I get to the truth? And then I started pursuing apologetics and things like that when I was doing my history degree. And I ended up leaning more and more towards philosophy, because philosophy felt like it really gave me the tools to pursue the truth. Does that make sense? It's kind of a roundabout answer.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe I can just try to recap a little bit. So you had a concern with authenticity, right? And it sounds like maybe you weren't exactly sure how to pursue that. Is that a right way to say that? And then you got some good advice from C.S. Lewis. You saw that there was tension in what authenticity ought to look like in your life, maybe.
Right.
And then finish it for me.
Yeah.
Like bring it back around to authenticity.
I suppose I was thinking about the yearning for integrity and authenticity requires that you are in alignment appropriately with reality. And so that just to me is truth. Like lining up your mind and the world, or mind side is the same as world side. I'm appropriately recording and responding to reality. And so that seems like the way to do things. And that seems like what we mean by authenticity. And that means I'm aligned in some sense with the world I live in. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. So authenticity is I'm being, well, I mean, I guess one common way to say it is I'm being true to myself, right?
That makes sense. Yeah.
So there's a way you are, and you're going to, I guess, develop self-knowledge, maybe even showing that to others is part of authenticity.
Suppose, yeah. Saying what you mean, meaning what you say.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting quote. I think Mark Twain said something like, people, like, liars have to remember too much, or I have too bad of a memory to be a liar. Something like that. It's
right.
if you don't lie, like never, like you don't have to remember anything if you tell the truth all the time. And I found that very true in my life, because when you misrepresent yourself, it's like you consistently have to track and remember, oh, this is the way I represented myself to this person, and I've got to sort of take on that air with other people. And it's like that is deeply inappropriate in a number of ways, but it also is deeply impractical. If you misrepresent yourself to certain people, you'll have to remember how to code switch back into that. And so I think authenticity, being true to yourself and being true to the world around you, is pretty important. And I think it's a pretty natural thing that most people experience. But would you say that that's fairly?
I think that Mark Twain quote, the way that you've tied that into this conversation,
the badly quoted paraphrase.
But the idea is there, and I think that really makes the connection between authenticity and truth.
Cool.
For me, it makes it very clear.
All right.
Okay, I want to talk about, and you've already alluded to this a little bit in your answer, but what exactly is truth?
Okay.
And particularly, so maybe you could talk about it as a philosopher, but then I'd like to know, is there any biblical data that backs up kind of how philosophers, such as yourself, think about truth?
Okay. Yeah, well, there's a number of, I don't think I could rattle it off chapter and verse, different theories of truth. There's a number of them. Correspondence theory of truth is one. There's deflationary views of truth. There's different ways that you can cash out the terms in jargon, but maybe I should avoid that. But I think the correspondence view of truth, where a proposition, which is the content of a sentence, like, so if I say snow is white, in
English.
In English, yeah, in American, yeah. I'm coming from Europe, so it's like, so I'm like in American. No, say snow is white in English, and then I say snow is white in German, for instance, which I.
Schnee ist weiß.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so but they both mean the same thing. They have the same content, you might say. So that's the proposition, like the meaning of it, the ultimate meaning of it. The correspondence with theory of truth is that the content of that sentence lines up with the fact in the world. So a fact would be like a chunk of the world, so a world chunk. So you have a fact and then a proposition, the content of a sentence and a piece of the world. When the content of the sentence lines up appropriately, in whatever way that might mean, lines up appropriately with the world, that means it's true. And so truth is the relation between the proposition and the fact, the world chunk and the content of the sentence. So if you think of it like that, then truth is, it stands between two things, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's kind of how I think of truth, in a rough way. I'm sure that there's probably all kinds of philosophical caveats that I'd have to put in there.
Sure.
But it's like, I think that that's the sort of appropriate thing. There's a harmony between what I say and what I'm pointing at, might be a way to say it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this probably needs more fleshing out, but I talk to my students a lot about this idea that truth is this relationship of correspondence between a proposition and reality. And other words that I use for a proposition would be like a claim or a description of reality.
There you go.
So you describe reality as being a certain way, and if that description matches reality the way it actually is, then you've got yourself a true proposition, right?
Well, it sounds like authenticity, right? It's like my description appropriately represents the world.
Yeah.
Right, there you go. So
Yeah,
there's like I can misrepresent the world. I could tell you that it's snowing outside and it isn't. But if you believed me and I wanted you to believe that because I had some sort of motive or ulterior motive, then it would be misrepresenting the world to say that even though on a sunny day I would tell you that it's snowing outside. If you believe me and I got my way, like that would be inauthentic in some way. But it would also be untrue. And I think those two line up in that way. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
One of the things that my students frequently get caught up on is there's a tension between, okay, you're telling me that truth is just this fact about reality, but then when I talk to people, I get different answers on what reality is like. So for example, I'm looking at a red cup right now. But if a colorblind person were here, they might not call it a red cup. They might call it some other, color. They might call it green, for example. Isn't that just two different truths? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's a tough one because there's a lot of hokum that surrounds the sort of idea that, well, what's something that's true for me and true for you, where something is perspectival. Like, because you're sitting to the right of me and I'm sitting to the left of you, therefore we see two different cups or two different things or two very different pieces, like views of the world, but they're both equally appropriate. And so how do we sort of correspond? Like, well, you and I might think, if we're not relativists, then we might think, well, there's a cup on the table, but somebody might think, well, it depends on how all the theoretical overlays that you might have and your the way that you conceive of it and the sociological implications of what cups are and things like that. All this jargon can come in. There is some place for that. We need to take into consideration that people's perspectives are valid. But when you start using the word truth, I think that you're using something a little bit stronger, and I think that people they play fast and loose with it. So one thing that I noticed is that you pointed to a cup, and you didn't say, well, that could be anything. You didn't say there could be a green dragon coming out of the desk. It's like, no, you pointed to a cup, and you expected me to see it when you pointed to it. So that's the sort of thing that I think gets mushy. If you want to be deeply committed to this sort of relativism, my truth versus your truth, you would have to say that cup could be like an 80-pound hippo or something like that. And then, but you see a cup, but that's not how I conceive of the world. It's like, well, one of those things is deeply inappropriate. If I'm wrong, then we should run, because that hippos are not nice, despite how they appear in board games and other things in popular culture. Hippos are pretty insane. But if you had something like that, like that sort of a discrepancy, one person is incorrect. And I think a lot of times that I've noticed, and I'm just in my world, the perspective that I've seen is that people are drifting away from this a little bit more, because they want to have the ability to call out certain kinds of injustice. They want to have the ability to call out certain kinds of things about the world that are inappropriate. But if you deny everything, if you say that cups could be hippos and there's just no way to tell because my truth is as good as yours, then nobody's opinion is any better than anyone else's. Yeah. So deeply bigoted people, for instance, would have just as good of an opinion as you. Some people might say like Donald Trump's opinion is just as good as Nancy Pelosi's opinion. And it's like, people don't like that in either side, like depending on what sort of political stance you take. So, but if you're deeply committed to relativism in the philosophy side, and you're like, well, cups could be hippos. You know, if you say that sort of thing, then you have to also say that there's no difference between Kim Jong-un, for instance, and Bernie Sanders. You can't say that they both see the world their own way, and they're just responding to the world as it appears to them. Yeah. Isn't that nice? And it's like, well, no, it's not. Typically, people want to push back on that. So anyway, that I think is one avenue of approach where you talk about truth. It's like there's a certain elasticity to the way that our perspectives integrate the world, but it's not infinitely elastic. You can't just, it could be a red cup or it could be green cup, but it's not a 80-foot water monster or something like that. You can't do that. So my truth, your truth, perspectival, there's an appropriateness to saying that there's latitude there, but it's not infinitely elastic. Does that make sense? Is that a decent answer?
Yeah, maybe I could say to you the way that I've kind of understood these types of situations, and I'll invite you to comment on them. So you've already talked about the correspondence theory of truth, in which you have a proposition, there's this content, a description of reality, which may or may not match up to reality. If it does match up to reality, it's true. If the description doesn't match up to reality, it's false. Okay? But I think of another relationship, which is the relationship between this description of reality and myself, and particularly what I think about that proposition.
Okay.
And so I can think that the description of reality matches reality, or I can think that it doesn't match reality. If I think that it does match reality, I'm going to say that that's belief. I believe that proposition is true, right? And the interesting thing is that my belief about that proposition is not a belief that's necessarily touching on reality directly. It's kind of it's traveling there through the proposition, right? So
I like
to
that,
speak.
Yeah.
So I believe propositions about reality to be true or false. But I can believe the proposition to be true or false, and the proposition could be true or false, and those are different things.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, no, it gets complicated. There's like two hookups there. You know what I mean? Like two ways. There's a lot of joints, and there can be play in the joints, which is difficult. Yeah. So what I do is like my area of specialization in my philosophy is epistemology, and epistemology has to do with questions like what is knowledge, what are beliefs, things like this. So it's kind of what I do. Now, there's one interesting thing about that. When you are deeply ensconced in a certain area, it can be so easy to sort of just slouch into jargon. And I don't want to do that. I like to answer people's questions. I talk to a lot more like common I don't study philosophy type people than I do philosophy people, which is ironic given the program that I'm in and whatnot. So I try to be like very like, okay, how would I say this to somebody? I think like one test that Richard Feynman gave about intelligence is like, could you explain your topic to any intelligent person who's interested, even if they don't know any of the terms and things like that? Could you explain it to them? And if you can't, you don't know it well enough. So we'll see if I know it well enough. Okay. But the difference between truth and belief is like truth for epistemologists, philosophers. Typically, truth is what we've talked about with correspondence. But belief would be what we call a propositional attitude. So is the attitude, quote unquote, that I take towards a proposition. And you can take pro attitudes and con attitudes towards a proposition. So like if we're talking about grass is green, is grass green? If you ask me, and I said I think grass is green, it's like what's going on there is I'm responding to the description of reality, right? But I'm taking a certain attitude towards the idea. Jordan, do you think grass is green? I sure do. I would say something like that. That's me taking a pro attitude. It'd be like a stance. Sometimes philosophers call it. Towards that proposition. Is that a correct way of representing reality? And I sort of co-sign on that. I ratify it in some sense. It's almost like I say, yes, this is the appropriate way to represent reality. And if you asked me on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whatever, it's like unless grass somehow turned yellow in some weird way, then I would say yes, grass is green. It's me taking a pro attitude. So you'd say that I believe that. And so I typically think that philosophers sometimes balk at this, but it's like I think that whatever I believe that I believe is pretty much the case. I don't think I could be wrong about what I believe that I believe.
Okay.
Now you might say that, well, you don't know your own beliefs well enough, and you dig into like what those beliefs mean, and you could sort of follow out or ferret out some of the implications about, like if I say, oh, well, I believe that the president of my country has a ton of integrity or something like that. It's like, and then somebody would tell me more about that person, and I might think, okay, well now I only believe it more, or now I only, now that you put it that way, I would shake my belief in it. What I would call that is confidence, or sometimes called credence. So it's a certain level of confidence. My confidence level in a belief is one way to think about it. So just to kind of tie it back up, belief is sometimes treated as like a toggle switch. It's true or it's false. I do believe it or I don't. But a lot of times philosophers like Elizabeth Jackson, for instance, is great on this. She talks about how you have a certain level of confidence in that belief. And you can have a certain like, what's the percentage of confidence that you hold in a belief? And I would say, just as a heuristic, as just a rough rule of thumb type thing, you would say, you might say that if I have more than 50% credence, more than 50% confidence in some belief, then I believe it. Then my belief switch is toggled. I do believe that. I'm taking that pro stance towards it. Some people think it's less, some people think it's more, but I put it at 50%. If it's over 50%, then I do believe it. Over 50% confidence in something, then I do believe it. Yeah. Does that make sense? Kind of a...
And I mean, ultimately, like, there's no way to know the exact percentage, but that's kind of the idea, right? I think it's more likely true than not. And so I believe it.
Yeah, more likely would be like more than 50-50.
Yeah.
I'm not agnostic. 50-50 would be agnostic. If I'm 51, then I believe it, but it's very weak. But my confidence level is enough to say that, yes, I do believe that.
Yeah. Let me dig into something you said there about believing you can't really be wrong about believing your beliefs, something like that, right? If you believe something, then you do believe it.
Agreed.
I think some people could be listening to this and thinking like, well, you know what? I believe that God is in control of everything. But then when I go through my life and I look at the way I live my life doesn't really match up with that. Right. Is that me? Am I wrong about believing that God is in control of everything? What would you make of that kind of question?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that there's a distinction here that might help. There's occurrent beliefs and dispositional beliefs. So those are big words. That's sure. Interesting. Occurrent means it's just happening now. If I call attention to the fact that you're wearing socks, you weren't thinking about it. You were aware of it, but you weren't aware that you were aware of it. So you believed it, but you didn't call it to mind or bring it, to the forefront of your imagination or whatever. That's the sort of thing that I would say dispositional beliefs sort of live there. So it's like things that you aren't thinking about or aren't currently considering. Those are dispositions, right? And then occurrent beliefs are the ones that are happening right now, the ones that are currently before my eyes. I think that Keith is sitting in front of me. I believe that. That's an occurrent belief. But I also believe that, like, grass is green, for instance, or something like that. I also believe that my cats will probably need to be, or my sister's cat will probably be fun and happy to see me or something like that when I get home. Like, I do believe that, but I didn't think about it until I called it to mind. So I think a lot of times dispositional beliefs, we can be wrong about what we believe there, but not a current belief. So not the ones that we're currently considering. That I believe this in this moment. I might double down on something that you ask me just because like I'm like, oh yeah, I think that's what I hold. But it's like examining your confidence when it appears to you when you're really thinking about it and you're clearly thinking about it. I don't think you can be wrong about that. But it's like that is a controversial sort of idea in philosophy. We might get into some deep waters. But yeah, there are some things like you believe. What was their question? That God exists?
That God is in control of everything.
Right. Yeah, and so yeah, like there's definitely is like sometimes people are a little bit they measure their commitments a little high, a little too high, and then it's like, well, I think C.S. Lewis said you don't know how much you trust a rope. If you were just using it to cord off some boxes, you might say you trust that rope. But if you have to hang over a precipice, you might start feeling a little bit less confident in that sort of thing. And so yeah, so when our beliefs are tested, it brings to the forefront what our confidence level really is in those things. And that's a complicated question. But for the most part, I think you believe you know what if you're considering a belief, you have pretty strong reasons to believe that that's what I believe, believing what you believe in.
Yeah.
Is that answer?
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate that.
Sorry, I feel like I'm giving very here's the technical response. You asked a pretty direct question about like, do you know what you believe? And I'm just like, I think so, but all these philosophical reasons, it's like a little bit less surfacey.
No, that's good. No, that's good. I mean, we can do our homework now and think about our current beliefs and dispositional beliefs. That's we learned something today.
Cool.
Great. So let's maybe shift gears a little bit. You've mentioned C.S. Lewis a number of times. I know that C.S. Lewis has been very impactful in your life. And particularly, he wrote a book, The Abolition of Man, and I really like particularly the first third of that book. It's an essay called Men Without Chess, right? And he really takes head-on a view of thinking about the world and truth in that chapter that I know you have said was impactful for you.
Yes.
And could you maybe just expound a little bit on that? I think it would be fun to hear, like, how does C.S. Lewis go about identifying this bad view of truth?
Yeah.
What does he think is wrong with it, and how does he go about correcting it? Like, what advice does he give?
It's a good question. So Men Without Chests was a lecture at Magdalen College that he gave, but it was the book The Abolition of Man is in a more condensed version. It's also called The Poison of Subjectivism. So he doesn't pull punches about what he thinks about this. And I believe I mentioned relativism earlier, just briefly, but subjectivism and relativism are very similar. I mean, relativism I think is a little bit more specific. Sociocultural relativism is one of the more technical ways of putting this. But the idea of subjectivism that Lewis is concerned with is the idea that we sort of make up values. We say like goodness is sort of like what society says goodness is, or what people say goodness is. That's a very rough characterization. But the idea that we're sort of making up what's good, or as a group, as a society, or something like that, we make up what's good. So, for instance, you have society A believes that you love your neighbor as yourself, and society B believes, well, maybe you love your neighbor, but you also, maybe it's a Spartan thing, and they also very much value strength and being strong in war or something like that. And so, if we were to go, if we were to be denizens of the other, so citizen A goes to civilization B, and citizen A talks to them and says like, well, I think what you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't be training children to fight or something like that, being brutal in your treatment of them. And they would be like, well, that's just what we do here. Like, I'm sorry that you don't enjoy our society, but like, there's no way to say good or bad or something like that. And Lewis is very insistent on this. He says there's no way that we can imagine new values any more than we can imagine a new primary color. And so it's not the case that values are somehow made up by societies. And there's a number of pushbacks that he gives to this sort of thing. Like if it was one society said, love your neighbor as yourself, and the other one says, hey, eat your neighbor as yourself, or something like that. It's like, well, which one's better? Which one do you prefer? And it's not just the way you were raised or something like that, which is what can be floated sometimes. He's very insistent that that's not the case. And so, and I agree with him on that. I think that there's certain, like, it's almost like the cup on the table thing with the hippo. It's like there's a certain elasticity to the way that we practice our moral judgments and the way that we see reality, but it's not infinitely elastic. It's not that love your neighbor as yourself and eat your neighbor as yourself or something like that would be. Yeah, they're not in lockstep. One of them's better than the other.
So you could have cultural, manifestations of these values that look a little bit different, right? Like it might be polite to shake a hand rather than to bow, or vice versa, right? but both of those are going to be representative of the same values that are unchangeable across cultures. Is that sort of the thing that you're talking about here?
Yeah, it's deep waters, of course, and I don't want to. I don't want to be like misrepresented. Be like, oh, this is an easy question. It's like this is a very deep question, even in ethics right now. This is still a very strong question. But yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. But yeah, I just want to make sure that it's like, yeah, there's a lot going on. We're juggling, we're juggling right now. So it's like, absolutely. Yeah, but no, that's exactly right. And I think Lewis is very insistent on that. So the name "Men Without Chests," what he's talking about is the idea that the quote is that he says the head rules the belly through the chest, and what he means is the head is the intellect and the belly is the appetite. And then the chest element is what makes humans, rationality. How do you balance what you are sort of driven towards instinctually, or your appetites, just your appetitive sort of the world that you live in? How do I want these things? I don't want those things. And then sort of how do you balance that with the intellect, with the rationality, or with not rationality, because rationality is more of the chest element, but how do you balance that with the higher needs? The sort of like, well, I need to be appropriate to my neighbor. I need to be, I have these sort of values that I need to be fair and just and things like that. So that's the head element. Then you have the belly element. He's like, well, the head rules the belly through the chest. And what he's saying is that it's like, well, in saying that values are subjective, that we're ebbing away the chest element, where we're losing the ability to have the intellect or the higher sort of forms of thought govern the appetite. And so he says that intellectually people are inflating their head and then ebbing away the chest, and then they're saying like, we have big strong heads, and it's like, well, actually it's just the comparative, because the chest element is missing, that the balance between these two is actually not really there, and so you're sort of letting your appetite run free and not really governing it the appropriate way. And said men without chests is a problem, because you need to have that ability to balance the two. Anyway, does that make sense to you? Did I cover too much?
I mean, it is a lot. Yeah. I sort of apprehend where you're saying. I'm not sure that I could say exactly how the subjectivist concern is creating the problem here.
Yeah, it is tricky, because I don't want to go off on a tangent, but it is essentially what he's saying is that the intellect needs to rule the appetites. But if you don't get taught that certain appetites, no matter how natural they seem, need to be governed or subdued, and you get taught this, that there's something good there about ruling those appetites in a certain kind of way, then you won't be able to do it over time. You won't be able to really control yourself in that sort of way. And this gets into Locke and Plato and a bunch of other things that Lewis wants to commit to. But essentially, it's like that's the idea. If you sort of espouse this subjectivism, then you lose the ability to control the more base or lower urges or something like that. So if that makes sense, but essentially it's just that it's like you need to be trained to do this, and you need to recognize that it's like we're not making up values as we go along. More often what happens is when you go with a Nietzschean ethic or something like that, or different things that are more subjective, what you end up doing is you take one of the values, like what you would call beneficence, which is being good to other people, or special and general beneficence or something, and you sort of wrench it out of its context and then blow that up to be the only real value. And you sort of like inflate one part of the value system, which can't be moved, and is like the colors, and you make that the only color, or you make that the only value, and you truncate the other ones. You say, well, it doesn't matter that I'm, for instance, that I'm generous. What matters is that I'm just kind to, and I don't do harm or something like that.
Why does that happen?
Well, typically it's because people will try to avoid a number of things that the value system that is just manifestly there imposes on them due to different lifestyles or something like that, and they want to live a certain way, and they think to themselves, well, if all values are just made up, then we can just sort of jettison the ones I don't want, and then but pursuing what I do want, I am going to in some way espouse a certain kind of value which is already there. Which is what Lewis is saying. So the subjectivist was like, well, values and duties and these things like that, it's all made up, it's all hypothetical, nothing really imposes on us. We make the world that we want to live in the way that we want to live in it. But ultimately what happens is, over time, you'll notice that it's like they've espoused one of the values that have been espoused by all human cultures, and he argues for like which ones there are. But you ultimately just take one or a part of one, and then you blow it up to be the only value. So kindness might be the only one. But really, like kindness needs to be coordinated with love and firmness and other things like that. Otherwise, you just end up with a mess. Is what he ends up arguing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So basically, it all begins with not believing in a firm, I guess, for lack of a better word, a firm view of truth, where the world really is a certain way, and it's not whatever you want it to be, right? And when you shy away from that, when you start to drift from that, you start to lose your attachment to what is genuinely good in the world, right? Maybe you pick up on some of it, but inevitably you're going to miss out on some, and so that's going to lead to a life that is just not what it was designed to be, right? You're not going to be able to flourish as a person. Your society is going to run into problems.
Sure. Or maybe your society gets real strong and takes over the next society and converts them to your view. You know, it's like, but a lot of times these things are cast in terms of power.
Right.
And I think that's a real problem. I don't think that might makes right. And I think that can be argued for. I don't think that that's just a sort of like, well, that's my personal private fancy. It's like, no. I think that there's something. I think there's more merit to it than that. It might be a little far afield from our discussion. But no, I think that's right.
That is very relevant to modern society, right? Postmodernism is huge, and it is very grounded in power. Yes. And it's important to recognize that comes from that. It's ironic to me to even talk about grounding in a postmodern world because it's all it's all so wildly subjective. Yeah. But it's grounded in this idea, so to speak, that there is no right way to talk about things, right? There is no truth. And so ultimately it does just become this power struggle. And you're enforcing your views on me, and I'm going to try to overthrow your views and make my values the right ones, right?
Right.
So maybe just real briefly, I know we're running short on time, but let's try to bring it home to the Christian world a little bit. Yeah. Are there any ways that you've seen that you think Christians miss the mark on truth, and that it plays a negative role in Christians' lives when they get this issue wrong?
Yes, it's a bit of it's. I can be a bit of a. I could be like a. I can kind of be nagging about this with my Christian in my Bible studies and things like that, where it's like what matters is that we're appropriately representing the world that God made, and I think that's really important. And I think a lot of times Christians will, like in my experience, like a lot of times Christians that I know will misrepresent the scriptures because it's like, well, I can pick out a Bible verse, take it out of its context, and it sounds good in English, so like Jeremiah 29:11 or something like that, where it's like, oh yeah, have you read the surrounding chapter? Have you looked into this? It's like it's actually pretty rough what's going on there, and so like I think I think it's unfortunate. It's a wonderful library index, the Bible verses being broken down and things like that, but it's very helpful to sort of index, but it's problematic when you don't read verses and things like that in context, and I think a lot of times in the Protestant world anyway that I grew up in. People will think of Bible verses as like what the Bible says, and that can be a problem because it's very easy to sort of if you took like for instance if you took like a 10-second snippet of this conversation and then just pulled it out of context and treated it like it's some sort of rule of thumb that you need to like live by, some quote that you'd said or something like that, then you might misrepresent my view on certain things pretty deeply, and or your view or whatever, or whoever. If you pull these things out of context and just say, well, Keith said at one point, you just sort of rattle off a sentence completely out of apart from its context, that wouldn't be something that you necessarily believe. And then if they were like, well, but that's what Keith said, I took Keith at his word, why is he not? He's lacking integrity. Maybe they might say it's like that would be deeply unfair, and I think it'd be difficult to sort of untangle that knot. But I think people do it all the time with the Bible, and I think Christians do it quite a lot. And it's like, though I think it's deeply important that we memorize the scripture verses and things like that, and we can get a lot of inspiration from it, you need to be able to integrate what some people call the whole counsel of God. And if you're not interested in the truth, if you're just interested in like, okay, well, I'll just take things as they come and sort of get my tearaway calendar advice from my my Bible, it's like I think you can come away with some really bad rules of life. But a pursuit of truth in a more holistic way, I think, is a much better way to do it. And I think Christians ought to and are obligated to by Scripture do that. Anyway. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense to me, and I think that is excellent advice. I think that probably anybody listening to this could think of a time when somebody has pulled a verse out. They've gone through their index, got the verse that sounds good to them at the time, and used it in an inappropriate way. And so I think that is a great reminder.
There was a quote. It's like, I can do all things through taking a verse out of context, or something like that. It's like because everybody uses that verse in the Philippines, so difficult. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that we're going to have to end it there. Jordan, this has been a lot of fun for me. I hope we get to do it again one day. But thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And
thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely.
It's my pleasure. Anytime. And thanks to everybody who's been sitting in with us and listening. And we will see you again another time.
Thank you.